Hello and welcome to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Rich Aylesbury.
And me, Stephen Boniface. Welcome to Talking Conservation and another episode. Today we're talking to Jonathan Taylor, who is the Director and Executive Editor of Cathedral Communications, who publish the Building Conservation Directory. So welcome, Jonathan. I'm just going to tell our listeners a little bit about you. So I understand that you started by studying architecture and you did a couple of years, but then you decided, thanks to when you did your year out, you got interested in conservation and older buildings, and you decided to take a slight change of direction. And you ended up doing an architectural conservation course at Heriot Watt. And you've got a BA in history of design as well. And also you've spent time working with Gordon Michel in Calne in Wiltshire. So that's all part of the background. And that's all, you did all of that before becoming a conservation officer at Kensington and Chelsea for a few years. And it was whilst you were there that you and others came up with the idea for the Building Conservation Directory. And it must have been around this time, 1993, when I think we first met. I advertised in the Building Conservation Directory at the time, and you've got me to write a couple of articles over the years, so thank you very much. But it's grown and grown and grown, and so now obviously there's quite a bit of a stable of publications that the Cathedral Communications oversee, and so we're interested in talking about that. So that's just a very potted history, but tell me, you started in architecture. What made that change? What made you think about changing your direction? What was it that triggered that?
First of all, growing up in Manchester, surrounded by decaying splendour of Victorian architecture, railway stations, terracotta buildings, moderately underrated. I mean, you compare the number of listed buildings in Manchester at the time with the number of listed buildings in, say, Bath, as Manchester was probably, they would argue, the number one Victorian city outside London. I would probably throw in Birmingham being at least as good as the equal of Manchester. Anyway, so stunning Victorian architecture, stunning decay, and then in my year out doing architecture, I worked for a company that was involved in putting back the Victorian terraces in Salford and sort of west side of Manchester, Coronation Street style of housing, cobbled streets, narrow little houses with outside bathrooms. We were putting bathrooms back inside. It was a pretty deprived area. We put in a load of new windows. Bonfire night, a lot of the windows came out and went onto a bonfire. It was quite challenging, quite a challenging environment. And then other work I was doing on the year out was with housing association work, which was on new build, and that really depressed me. I really didn't like doing that stuff. Concrete, absolutely minimal stuff. The Victorian stuff, then engage with the people. And to me, conservation has always been, on the one hand, you get the magnificent palaces and the stately homes, and on the other side, you get the Victorian terraced houses, which are all equally in need of getting the right technology, the right people, doing the right stuff, and particularly at that time, before the lime revolution, there was a lot of really, really bad stuff going on. And it's not just the lime; it's the people just didn't look at details. So I found that really fascinating. Then the next major one was wandering around Europe, hitchhiking in a year out, looking at great architecture across the world. Yeah, so you've got the social side, you've got the beautiful architecture, the beautiful art, the beautiful creativity that people have produced fantastic places. It's not just buildings, it's places. I mean, if you go to Venice and you wander around Venice and you're walking between these buildings, and then the next minute there's a bridge over water, and then next turning, it's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. So it's, I would say that it's, we're knitting together places in the conservation community when we're putting, we can look at individual buildings and we can restore, or we can repair, or we can convert, and we can adapt. Ultimately, these are these are all going into places, and it's the surroundings which are really so interesting.
So for you, part of it is not just the building, it's the whole social side of it as well, by the sounds of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we all live in, or work in, or visit historic places. We can't all live in historic houses, but all of us throughout the UK have access to amazing buildings and amazing places. One of the things which has always interested me is the places of worship. Churches, grade one listed buildings, so many of them dotted across the country, many of them containing museum grade, art gallery grade tombs, stained glass, furniture. What happens to those when those buildings are closing because there are so many, there's a change in our demographic? There's got to be a solution. That's one of the many things that motivates me. But ultimately, it is about people. It's about us appreciating our surroundings, and that brings in all buildings. It's not just the grade one listed buildings. It's the places we live.
It's interesting you talk about Victorian Edwardian buildings, and you grew up in Manchester. I grew up in East London. Exactly the same. Every building I lived in until I moved to Bishop's Stortford, where I am now, was a Victorian Edwardian building. And for me, also, conservation is not just about the grand places. It is about, if you like, the ordinary house, the townhouse, the terraced house that people live in.
There's also a bit of a geek in me as well, which actually really likes the material side of it and the deterioration. So it's not just the beauty, and I think I probably share a lot of this with you, Stephen. It's how things deteriorate. The dry rot, the death watch beetle, and how do you control it? And it is really interesting that you look at the mechanisms. You understand the mechanisms with which buildings decay. My master's thesis was on terracotta buildings, and they are particularly fascinating. They're particularly beautiful. Manchester's full of these amazing structures, as is London and Birmingham, with really interesting problems. You've got steel frame buildings, you've got salts coming in from the outside, the pollution, you've got inherent salts within the breeze concrete mix, which is causing the metal work to corrode and expand, shatter the pots. So you've got art, you've got science, you've got chemistry, well, physics, engineering. You've got so much. Just looking at these individual buildings, I'm very lucky to have worked to have spent most of my life working in conservation.
Well, I mean, for me, what's fascinating is, and what we're going to bring on to almost the purpose of chatting to you, Jonathan, and I think it's becoming incredibly clear about why the Building Conservation Directory came about. And I suppose from learning that bit of, with your history, connecting the dots in terms of what went into the directory, about why it was produced, and also what it does to support who, and who's it aimed at and who's it targeted at. We'd love to hear that.
It isn't entirely me. There was a couple of other people involved. Gordon Sorensen was my business partner from the beginning, who sadly died last year. He was an accountant. He worked for Price Waterhouse, and he wound down the Maxwell estate. And he came in, and he and I were talking about different things that we would like to do as a new development while I was working at Kensington and Chelsea. And he said, well, the way to get the information out, because that was a basic problem, the problem was that this is before the internet. It was in the mid 90s, early 90s. There was no way that you could get the information about lime mortars, for example, out to the general public except through expensive books. And people don't read it. And in Caen, in Wiltshire, I was working with Colin Burns came down to Caen for looking at this is an urban regeneration project, which was my first proper job after Masters in Conservation. Colin Burns came down and we had him working with local builders to make sure that they understood how to use lime in the correct way. And we had really good take up of those on those courses. People came along, learned how to do it, and then I'd see them a bit later on working on another project, doing the usual stuff with Portland cement on the local limestone buildings. I realised that doing the courses is one good approach. It's got to be done on so many different ways, so many different levels. Gordon's idea was that we would produce a directory. We would get the directory out free of charge to all and sundry. So it wasn't aimed at conservation architects. It was aimed at all architects, all surveyors. And the important thing was to get it out to as wide a community as possible that was involved in restoring historic buildings. It was a great idea, sitting around a coffee table talking about it. And a couple of weeks later, Gordon said, I've just handed my notice from Price Waterhouse. This is a guy who was earning really good money, who was just giving up really good career, where he would continue to be, earning quite a lot more money than we ever could in conservation, and saying, yeah, we'll do it. So we did it. So yeah, I take my hat off to Gordon.
Absolutely. I mean, intrigued to know then. He clearly had crunched his numbers and done his figures, I would assume, to give up such a job to say, how is this going to grow and become useful and both pay the bills? Quite frankly, I mean, so we'd love to understand how that works or was planned to work.
Well, in theory, you send out 10,000 copies of a publication free of charge to all these people, supported by advertising exclusively from the conservation community. So the directory, which is what we came up with, the directory goes out. It has architects, surveyors, gold leaf manufacturers, paint manufacturers. But at the time, you're looking at, for the paint manufacturers, you needed the silicate paint manufacturers, you need the lime washers, you need the lead used at that time for grade 1 listed buildings only. We needed the lime plasterers, we needed the fibrous plasterers. So it's a mixture of craftspeople, suppliers, all of them, at least on paper, kosher, making sure that we can put together a publication with really useful stuff in it, plus the articles written by, thank goodness, people like Stephen, the specialists in the field. John Ashurst, for example, who helped me with my terracotta dissertation years before. He was one of the first people to write and was really supportive, as was the entire community. Financially, though, we got to, in that first year, we got to the point where there weren't an awful lot of advertisers. We had the publication and we looked at it and we looked at the finances and we decided it was cheaper or less costly to carry on and produce it than to close it at that point. Anyway, we produced it. A couple of weeks later, we went to Restorex with our book, which had already gone out to 10,000 people. And we had a little stand. And I had a cup of coffee when the doors opened. And the cup of coffee was cold, sitting next to me. And I didn't get the chance to pick it up until lunchtime. We just had a constant stream of people coming through and saying how much that publication was needed. And then the next one was a bit bigger, made a little bit more, made money. So yeah, it was. my wife Lisa and I, we funded it from our end. Well, we were living in London at the time. We bought one house, a nice little Victorian terraced house. Well, actually, the first one was a flat, and did that up, made it rundown property. Took the money out of that, put it into the next house, and so flipping houses in London, that gave us the money that we needed, and fantastic support from Lisa, because it was a massive leap of faith to do that. So basically, I didn't have any money and had very little income for a whole year. Yeah, Gordon, he was the one that really got the whole thing started.
You mentioned that you sent out 10,000 copies. Were they specifically to owners, or how did you select the 10,000? And have you actually ever used a list of owners? How have you found people to send it to?
We had quite a few. I don't know how we got. I can't remember how we managed to get the 10,000 initially. I mean, obviously there are some obvious sources. For example, architects and surveyors. That's easy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we had all the yellow pages from the entire country. When I say the entire country, that's England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And so we just went through the key areas, and we sat down and we made a database of 10,000. When that database is crucial, because if advertisers get a response from their advert in the BCD, then they'll come in next year. So getting that distribution is absolutely critical. So it includes the people from the yellow pages, but it also includes a sort of top-down approach to building owners. So we went through the estates, London estates, for example. There's quite a which own vast. Grosvenor Estate owns a vast quantity of, and the Grosvenor Estate was actually really helpful to us. They were very supportive. Their surveyor wrote one of the articles in one of the early editions.
Is that Colin Redman?
Colin Redman, yeah.
Yeah, I worked with him for a long time. Yeah, good man.
So the estates, Natural Trust, of course, big
Yeah.
one, local authorities, and there are lots of oddities like police stations. How do you get through to every church? So we've on the churches we've done the diocese. So every diocese gets at least 2 copies. So that covers the Church of England fairly well. Catholic church was an available list that we managed to get our hands on. Some of the smaller denominations, particularly in Scotland, I'm not really certain that we actually get that deep into them. And it would be really nice to make sure that we got every single listed church building in the country within at least a stone's throw from a copy of the directory. We probably get better penetration, so to speak, through conservation architects and conservation surveyors. So I would imagine that most places, most historic buildings in the country have either direct access or through one person away from seeing a copy of the BCD.
So with I suppose the birth, if you like, of Tim Berners-Lee and the internet, how did that fundamentally change the model, or did it not change it too much? Because I've used the directory a huge amount, and it's been incredible for doing my own home, because the articles are on there and they're freely accessible, and it's absolutely fantastic and a great resource that I very much point people towards. But from what I'm hearing, it wasn't necessarily the target market, wasn't the homeowners, albeit that great, the quid pro quo is actually they can benefit. So how did that? I'm curious to understand how that shifted, I suppose, with the internet in terms of when.
No shift.
Yeah.
We've always tried to make sure that everything that we produce is freely available to everybody. So the second the internet, once the internet got going, which I think about 95, 96, we put up our first website, and we chucked everything onto it that we'd already published. So all the early articles are online, and every year everything that we produce, whether it's historic churches, heritage retrofit, or building conservation directory, all those articles go online. We've also, along the way, we've picked up work from other organisations, particularly the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, we do their publications. We've always encouraged everybody that we've worked with to publish everything that they do online. Maybe not immediately, but the older copies, everything, it goes online. We're working with historic buildings and places at the moment. It's one of our other clients, and we are about to send out copies of Heritage Now to all and sundry. And I think that's the right thing to do. And there might not be in the case of Heritage Now, it'll be the previous edition which goes to everybody. It's partly to encourage them to become other people to become members of historic buildings and places, but partly it's because everybody needs to have access to that information. There's some really good stuff being produced by organisations, and I don't think that when somebody gives up their time free of charge to write and they put their heart into and provide their trade secrets, and I've never met anybody in conservation who regards their information as being a secret. People are incredibly generous with their time, and the whole purpose of this is to get information out to the public, but not just the public, building contractors. What proportion of the building industry is trained in conservation? It's a tiny proportion. And yet we've got 1 in 4 buildings predating 1914. Traditionally constructed, everybody, all builders, well, not quite all builders. There are some builders who specialize exclusively in new build, but vast majority, they need to understand the way that old buildings work. You can't just treat them the same as everything else.
I totally agree. Actually, it's interesting. I've recently taken to you can see all the books behind me. I've been buying up some second-hand books, and quite a few from the late Victorian period. And I find it fascinating to see what they talk about and how they built at that time. And often it's not what we assume. I just find the Victorian Edwardian period fascinating personally. But anyway, that's perhaps another subject for another day. But going back to the success you've had, and you talk about how it started, and almost from day one, you had people queuing up to talk to you about it and to get involved. What sort of problems have you faced with people wanting to advertise or write articles that you didn't think were appropriate? Bearing in mind we're talking about building conservation, how did you go about vetting people? I use that term. Vetting is probably not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. How did you ensure that you got the right people, the right articles, the right advertisers?
Articles are easy, relatively easy. I've just remembered one mistake fairly early on for somebody who I will not name, who wrote an article which wasn't very good, and I edited it very heavily so that it became, he said the right things, and I put words into his mouth more than I should have. I had an irate call sometime later from one of the from somebody who had got him as a speaker at a conference.
Oh,
and they then discovered that he really didn't know his subject.
Oh,
and he had some dodgy ideas, which I thought I'd managed to explain to him why those ideas weren't valid. But bottom line is, I shouldn't have published his article. And I certainly shouldn't have polished it. So, yeah.
It's quite the CV entry, isn't it? I suppose, sort of saying, yes, published in the Building Conservation Directory, and I'll put that on my CV for sort of, yeah.
I did it once. I'll never, ever do that again. So, yeah, early days, and I learnt. Advertise is more difficult. Some tricky calls I've had over the years with people trying to explain to them why we weren't going to put their product in. Particularly on substitute materials. You could argue that putting a substitute material on the roof of a building will keep the water out. It's cheaper, and it means that you'll have more money left over at the end of the day to do some serious conservation work inside. I've had some conversations with the great and the good, who were very supportive in the early days, and we came to the conclusion that we would just take a particular approach. I mean, we're never going to include concrete roof tiles that look like pan tiles. But some of the slate materials, reconstituted slates, no, I'm sorry, we can't put them in. The foam beams, the fake beams that people produce, I'm sure they were very good, but we just didn't put them in. As for the building contractors, every building contractor that advertised in the BCD, I spoke to them, and I only had to I just sort of led them down the route where they would just talk about the materials that they were using, and providing they mentioned a few key words, they would go into the directory. That's not to say that they were not capable of doing some bad work. But then, I think all people are. I'm sorry. It says at the start of the directory, this is a start in the specification process. And whenever I speak to anybody on the phone, I always say, if you're employing a contractor, you need to doesn't matter how good they are, it's always best if you get a really good surveyor or a good architect who understands historic buildings between you and the guy doing the pointing or whatever it is that they're doing, because people make mistakes. And it doesn't matter how good they are. If they've done one really good project, it doesn't mean to say that the next one is going to be any good. People do make mistakes. So people have often asked whether we could do a publication that was just purely of accredited people. That would mean missing out a lot of really good people who are not accredited, who work for National Trust properties. I mean, seriously good conservators or seriously good consultants, but they have no accreditation. So no, we've never gone down the exclusively accredited route. We've always gone down the route of saying, caveat emptor, they're the buyer beware. Just make sure that you've got the best possible advice that you can get.
From the homeowner's perspective, I suppose it's using the building conservation directory as not just a starting point, but as a resource to approach many different sources and trades as a starting point to ensure that you've still got that professional input as an intermediary, if you like, to sort of say, if you're a homeowner that doesn't necessarily know what needs to happen and about specification, and you haven't learned that information for yourself, and you can use the directory to upskill yourself. But if you haven't got that upskill, you need to make sure you've got the skilled person as the middleman. Is that a fair assumption? Or
yeah, and some homeowners will then go away and think that they can do the work themselves.
I can attest to that. For a lesser or better degree, lesser or greater degree, yeah.
Yeah, and likewise, I've done that as well, and I'm okay in joinery work. I would really not touch plastering or
Same.
rendering.
Yep.
Same here.
Yeah. But maybe some discrete pointing. Yeah. I'll get the mix right and I'll make sure that it goes off okay. But I'd probably, if somebody phones in, then I would discourage homeowners do phone in at regular intervals. And we have good long conversations about the principles of material selection, the principles of conservation. I always advise them to get a craftsperson who is specializing in that particular, and I will always try to discourage people from doing it themselves. I'm sure that there will be lots of people who can do it themselves and do it really, but just discouraging them from picking up the trowel themselves is, I think, probably a good starting point. Surveying, as you know only too well, Stephen, is such a complicated working out where damp comes from. You get damp at the base of the wall, and chances are that it didn't start at the base of the wall. Chances are that it came down from above because water runs down really well. But you're looking at the base of the wall and you see rising damp. It's not. Well, it might be, but if it is damp at the base of the wall, it's probably because the external ground level is higher. That's when it could be groundwater. But 9 times out of 10, it's coming from somewhere up above, and trying to work out where it's coming from is not something that most building contractors, most roofing contractors are capable of identifying. It's got to be somebody who is a building surveyor who's specialized in historic buildings and has got good track record of working with historic buildings. And even then, even if they have the right specialists and the right experience, sometimes people just have to say, well, I think it's from here, and I think it's this. The first thing that we'll do is we'll do this, and then if that doesn't cure it, then we'll go on and we'll look at something else. And that's an
You're
expert.
so right. I think actually that applies to defect analysis generally. So often people, I've had it where clients have expected me to wave that magic wand and just say, oh, it's this. And have been sometimes disappointed when I've said, actually, I'm not entirely sure. I think we need to do this first and see what happens. Now, whether it be cracking, whether it be damp or whatever, sometimes it is a stage process to work it out. And I think that is the correct professional approach. But so often the clients can be disappointed by that because they want the immediate response. But I totally agree with you on what you've just said. Yeah. One thing I'm interested in, though, is you talked about damp, and that's the perennial issue. As you know, in recent years,
Yeah.
the RICS, Historic England, and the PCA worked together to create the Joint Position Statement, which is a major step forward and has helped. But there are other things that over the years have changed. You mentioned about the lime revolution back in the late 80s, early 90s. And of course, I remember, was around at the time, and we saw this like, and we were thinking, oh, isn't this great? And of course, then we started to have NHLs as well. We think, isn't this good? We've got this whole range, spectrum of different products. And then in recent years, we're told, actually, should we be using NHLs? Or if we are, and so things are changing. How do you, I mean, obviously you read around, you keep up to date, but there must be some articles you've published in the past that you now think, oh, that isn't what we do now.
Yeah.
How do you get around that?
Yeah. John Ashurst, a classic.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
was proposing using the NHLs without realizing, without understanding that over time, because the research hadn't been done then. There was
yeah,
that has only relatively recently been done to realize that some of the NHLs set as hard as Portland cement over time. It takes it's the 28-day strength that we work with, the building industry works with, and the 28-day strength is not the same as it will be after 3 years or 5 years. And yeah, it's a problem. What do we do with the old articles? They're all dated. I'm not going to take John Ashurst's article down because it's or Paul Livesey's articles. There's a lot of really good information in there, but there are more articles up there. So on the website, so you can get the information that you need. Maybe we do have to revisit some of those articles, but I'm a bit snowed under at the moment, and it'll just be a matter of time.
it's rather
The
than
date's
take
there.
them down, though, could you just put something on there that says this was written in, so some of
We
the
do,
things
yeah.
in here have been superseded. Yeah,
Or even signposting to a related article which does have an updated perspective or view on things.
All articles are linked back to the main subject index. So any article that you follow, you can immediately follow more recent information on it. It does rely on people using it as a research source rather than as the definitive answer. And if we were going to produce it as the definitive answer, we would need to take off a few really really good articles. Haven't bitten that bullet yet.
I'd love to explore, I guess, the sort of the short and medium term future of the directory, specifically with some of the really kind of hot topics at the moment when it comes to conservation, and specifically with older buildings, is about the climate emergency, the relative efficiency of each of those buildings and how they compare to perhaps a more modern building, and the behemoth that is retrofit with regards to lots of people leaning into with various different materials and the potential impacts without necessarily the full long-term studies that we have on those. How we're going to how the directory, for example, is going to put articles out there which are going to benefit homeowners that want to do the right thing and benefit specifiers and architects, without necessarily knowing the full extent of what the future holds, just like we understood about NHL, are we potentially going to have a similar thing coming about with retrofit and applied insulation, for example? We'd love to know your thoughts on how that's going to be the challenge going forward.
No, I think you've said it there perfectly. It is. It's very much the same. We haven't done not all the information, not all the research has been done yet for retrofit. So the basic premise is that if you put insulation, say at ceiling level, you're stopping all of the warmth from going through to warming up those timbers which are beyond it, whatever material it is. So inside insulation, make inside wall insulation, solid wall, the wall becomes colder. What is the right? I mean, generally we know that the best approach is a cautious approach, that we make sure that the insulation that we're using is vapor permeable, but we do not know how cold we can make those structures. We do not know how much insulation you can put into your standard Victorian roof space before you end up with problems. So the closed cell insulation approach means that there is risk of sweating of the materials which are on the other side, but the vapor permeable materials allow moisture through, and there will be a dew point at some point, and we do not know. We can produce guidance, but we do not know at what point how much insulation we can put safely into a building. The other really interesting issue at the moment, I mean, we're all agreed that historic buildings need to be kept. Relatively are not altered, at least in terms of character. They contribute to the joy of walking through spaces, the pleasure of being in a historic building. And fine, you can reduce maybe those qualities, those aesthetic qualities to some degree, but you'll talk to some people in the conservation community who say that even a glimpse of a photovoltaic cell on the roof of a historic building, of a really fine historic building, is damaging its character. And we have to strike a balance. There are an awful lot of discussions which need to be had over a very short period of time, because all of this is happening right now. People are putting photovoltaics on grade 1 listed churches across the country. I'm not going to say that one approach is right and one approach is wrong. I'm a publisher. We will put out that information. We will put together the arguments. People have to have that debate. From my own point of view, personally, I think that there are some people that are too precious, that we need to strike a balance. We have to accept that there is a balance that has to be. Different people will put that balance in different places.
It's interesting you say that. I actually agree with you. Entirely. It's a view I share. And I was talking recently to some conservation officers, and we were talking about how the present approach to buildings has. I'm just thinking in a few hundred years' time, they're going to look back and they're going to say, well, the development of buildings and stopped in the 20th century with the conservation movement, in a sense, because up till the 20th century, effectively, well, 19th century, early 20th century, buildings evolved. Now, we can all argue about we've lost some fantastic buildings and some awful things were done to those buildings, but some of the buildings we love have evolved, and they were allowed to evolve and change. And the question I have is, has conservation gone too far in preventing change and preventing that gradual alteration? And I think what you're saying there is part and parcel of that discussion.
Absolutely. We need to have that debate, and we need to have it in a open and constructive, as open and as constructive an approach as we possibly can. I think ultimately it's going to come down to the main organisations, the main government bodies, so Historic England, CADU, and Historic Environment Scotland, to say what is permissible, but they need to take us with them. And something else I was going to say is that you could argue that knocking down a Victorian terraced house and rebuilding a new Victorian style terraced house with all the insulation in it and all the materials and the best form of construction will be far better in the long term, even taking into account comparing the new building with, say, a retrofitted building, and the carbon costs over, say, a 25-30 year period. The new house will outstrip the retrofit in terms of carbon saving. That said, one, the new materials that you're using will not last forever. What happens when you've got polystyrene underneath a concrete slab over a set period? What happens to? I mean, we know about plastic windows. They're plastic. They become brittle. You can't repair them. When you've got a damaged plastic window, you have to replace it. The whole thing. You can't splice in a little. And a lot of it comes down to maintenance. So although there's some really good research that has been done recently on Carrick for Historic England, on the pros and cons of restoration versus rebuild, retrofit versus rebuild, we haven't got all the answers. Then on top of that, you've also got the issue of what we as a society are prepared to lose. How much are we prepared to lose? I think we are looking at a balanced approach. And we have to remember, despite what some people say, we have to remember that listed buildings are a relatively small proportion of our overall building stock. We need to do the best we possibly can with them.
I looked at some figures recently because this often quoted, one in X number of buildings predate what have you. And when you actually look at solid wall construction or traditional, call it what you will, in other words, not cavity wall, solid walls were being built right up until 1940 or thereabouts. And when you start taking that into account, we've got a building stock on housing of around 24.5 million. If we look at pre-1940, it's about 10 million. So when you start looking at that, you're over 1 in 3. Not 1 in 4, not 1 in 5. It's 1 in 3. And then you say how many listed buildings? Well, if you're looking at housing, it's about 300,000, if that, of that 10 million or that 24.5 million. So you're quite right. It's a very, very small proportion. Yeah.
We do have to keep everything in perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in terms of not just the Building Conservation Directory, but also the other publications, do you want to talk, Jonathan, a bit more about the other publications and the other things that happen or that you on the Building Conservation Directory and the other things that you do? I mean, you mentioned the IHBC and so forth, but we'd love to hear about those.
Okay, so the first one we produced after the BCD. We've got a couple of salespeople on board who were looking for work to do. So the question of what was going to be the next publication, we went for churches because, as I keep on coming back to, they are congregations are dwindling. We need to draw attention to the amazing works of art that are held in these buildings. 2, we need to promote greater appreciation, but we need to promote greater use of these buildings. So a lot of these buildings could be used for communities, the general community. For there's been some really interesting developments over the last few decades where you get post offices now going into places of worship. You get cafes. Cafes is probably the most common, but also you get community use. So the pews, by and large, the pews are historically really important and they're part of the character, particularly the Victorian churches onwards, and older buildings with Victorian Georgian pews introduced. And to make more use of these buildings, you have to look at the possibility that this building will become redundant and take a deep breath and say, well, how are we going to do that? We need to have toilets in here and we need to have cooking facilities and we need to adapt these buildings. So the church historic churches was the number one, and I would say that next to retrofit is the biggest challenge that we're going to be facing over the next decade. So mega important. Next, after that, we produced one called Historic Gardens, and I'm afraid to say that Historic Gardens was entirely self-indulgent. We loved producing that publication. Great pictures and really interesting. So there's a geeky side, but there's also of how you work out what a garden looked like at some point in its past, and whether it's justifiable to recreate it. Then there are the plant specimens, and the people that were used to plant at different times, and then also touches on the wide landscape of urban trees, for example. Urban trees we will come back to again and again. We couldn't make historic gardens work, so we tried a few times. Financially, it just didn't work, and we've abandoned it, and we will not produce historic gardens again. I'm sorry, because it was such a lovely publication. But equally, churches is equally gorgeous. And I have a particular thing about Edwardian stained glass arts and crafts movement. And one day I will wander across Ireland taking photographs of the Antigloin stained glass windows. Again, totally self-indulgent. And I will do a book on... I shouldn't be saying this because somebody else is going to do it now. Antigloin is stunning. Some really great arts and crafts artists. So then next publication I'm going to mention is Heritage Retrofit. Heritage Retrofit, we did a couple of editions, and funnily enough, we couldn't make that viable either. So we are about to launch a new website, which will be looking exclusively at the retrofit, or not exclusively at the retrofit. It's a bit wider than just retrofit. It's sustainability and it's wider scope. So we're looking at climate change in all its glory, producing vast amounts of water, storm damage becoming increasingly prevalent. That's where I was going with the trees angle, urban trees. The heat island effect in cities needs to be softened by greenery, and all the London plains are more or less the same age. You know, they were planted in vast numbers. Many years ago, when I was a conservation officer at Kensington and Chelsea, I was putting in hornbeams and making as many streets as green as possible, including Kensington High Street, right down the middle of Kensington High Street. We came up with a proposal. I was conservation and design. So we came up with a proposal for a central reservation right the way down the street with bicycle parking and trees in between. And I went down Kensington High Street. We got the cycle stands in pretty quickly, despite the highways bod saying, you can't put cycle stands there. They'll die. All these cyclists walking across the middle of the road to park their bicycles, ignoring the fact that they risk their life in London traffic every day. Anyway, we got that, but we couldn't get the trees through, mainly because of the underground services. But I've been down Kensington High Street recently, and finally the trees are appearing. Small trees, I'm not sure why these trees are not attacking the services. But yeah, we need more trees in the urban centres. So the new website will look at climate change in all its glory, particularly how we use historic buildings. So it's not just a matter of introducing insulation. That's a new development. Robyn Pender, she's got a particular beef about insulation, and that we need to look at the way that we use historic buildings, and also the radiation that comes from cold walls. That your body heat is being lost to the environment, and we need to look at how we decorate, and putting blinds in that will the thermal blinds that will mean that you can achieve just as much insulation as you can from double glazing, admittedly only while the blinds are closed. But she's really good, and she's come in very kindly to co-edit the BCD with me. So last one and this one, so the first two editions with her name on it as well, and she brings in a really interesting perspective. Sustainability is a big aspect of the BCD. You could argue that anything which saves the embodied carbon in historic buildings is all part of reducing our immediate carbon cost. And then other publications, well, we do, as mentioned before, IHBC, Heritage Now, Chartered Institute for Archaeology, and a couple of others. We tend to focus exclusively on the conservation heritage side. We're also doing one at the moment. We're just helping out with the Straw Bale Association, which is quite interesting. They've come up with France, the French organization, have come up with really good guidance on straw bale construction. So it's been translated into English, and we're putting it out. We're working on it at the moment. That's pure sustainability and has nothing to do with heritage. Although you could argue that extensions to historic buildings and development in existing towns could all be done using sustainable materials. But that is a particular interest as well as the heritage side. It's the geeky side of construction.
Fascinating.
I was just thinking, looking to the future. I mean, obviously, your publications are across the UK at the moment. You've just mentioned taking a French article and translating that. Do you see a future where your publications could go more global?
The website is really interesting. The statistics show that I think it's 50% roughly is from the UK, and then of the rest, a third is from English-speaking countries, and then it goes wild. So you get people from all over the world, and they crop up in little statistics, little numbers from every single country you can imagine on Earth. So people are reading everything that we produce, and I'm sure that the IHBC, which they produce more publications per year than we do. Admittedly, we produce them all for them, but they produce a lot of stuff with a huge number of really great authors, and all of that is going global. Whilst I don't know their statistics, I'm quite sure they'll be the same as ours. It'll be a similar breakdown. So mostly UK and English-speaking countries. That includes Australia, Canada, the States, principally. Then after that, it's everybody. So France and Germany and the sort of the local European countries have very similar styles of architecture and very similar problems. America has very similar problems. So yeah, it is a global industry, and I'm acutely aware that costs of print is going up, although it is paper and therefore all recyclable. It is nonetheless, there is a carbon element to it, and we will never abandon print. There will always be printed publications. I really like print. That's maybe me, and I'm old-fashioned. Maybe somebody else will come along. But there will be an increasing amount which will be online. We're reducing the number of copies that we're printing of historic churches and encouraging people as much as possible to read it online. We'll see that's a new development, and we'll see where that takes us.
Fascinating.
Excellent.
Stephen, should we move on to books and buildings, do you think?
Oh, yes. Right, Jonathan. Books. We've already said how we all like books and reading. Well, two things really. What books would you suggest for our listeners that might want to get into conservation or develop if they're already in conservation? What might they read? Or just simply, what's your favourite book?
I'm sorry, I'm going to be really boring on this.
The Building Conservation Directory, is that what you're going to say?
No. I have exactly the same books that are behind Stephen's head. On my shelf, I've got the Practical Building Conservation series from Historic England, and they are absolutely fabulous. And yes, they're in print, and therefore they will become out of date. There are bits in there which aren't quite perfect now, but they're pretty good. So find your library that's got the copies in it, and they are an excellent. It's a huge range. I mean, what is it? Must be 2 feet of books of solid information covering all aspects of conservation, all materials. It's a materials-based approach containing some really good, really nice illustrations. There are thinner alternatives, but I would go for the I would. You can't afford to buy them all, so go to the library, get them out, use it, use your time. Just spend half a day on whatever subject you're dealing with at the time. Spend half a day in the library going through the relevant chapter of the series, and it's a fantastic achievement from Historic England. Fantastic, and John Asher's before that.
Thanks, Jonathan. And then the other question we like to ask all our guests is one of a particular building. Now, a particular building, whether it's something that really speaks to you with regard to conservation, or whether it's something that you just would implore people to go and visit for themselves. But we'd love to know your favourite building and why.
Thank you. This is one of those really self-indulgent moments. So for me, it was until a week ago. It was without doubt Alvar Aalto's TWA terminal with its beautifully fine, parabolic, weird, wacky shapes. And close second would have been probably Gaudi's equally weird and amazing cathedral in Barcelona. But I'm afraid I've just been to, and this is not going to go down well with the people who say I shouldn't be traveling to Sicily at this time of year in an aeroplane, but I'm afraid I did. We did with my family, and had a lovely time wandering around a Syracuse cathedral in Ortigia, which has. You've been there too. Okay,
I've been there. Fantastic, yeah.
Unbelievable. It has the Doric columns from the Greek temple, and in between, infilled with the structure of the 17th century architecture, and you walk in and you have this colonnade of the peristyle down one side, almost intact. So it's only the last column which has been sheared off, and you've got the capital sitting on top, and you walk in and there is this jaw-dropping moment. You know it's from the outside because you can see that the peristyle is there on the outside. And I have never been blown away to quite the extent that building blew me away. I mean, the idea that it has been a place of worship for thousands of years, and it's been adapted to suit another religion and another god, but it's still a place of worship. I mean, it's still just that continuity. You talk about, it is about people. It's people past and present. And it's that heritage, the concept of heritage. You know, it's not the only aspect of conservation that's important, but when you see it on that sort of scale, I've never seen anything like that before. It's just amazing.
We were there a few years ago, and we actually stayed in a hotel about 300 yards away from there. And so walked past it every day. And I remember also in the corner of the square there's another little church that from the outside looks a little bit run down. And you go in and there's a Caravaggio at the end above the altar. And you think anyone could walk in here. You literally just walk in. There's no security or you just walk in. There's a Caravaggio at the end. You think, what? Fantastic. Yeah. Ortigia, it's lovely. Yeah, we loved it. Yeah. You've taken me back now. Actually, for this for the YouTube side of this, I know I've got some photographs of that. So I'll look them up and may slot them in as B-roll into this for you.
I will send you one as well, because I think I've tried. I did my best to capture that character down that that aisle where you've got the Doric columns on one side and the Renaissance stuff on the other. Yeah, my geekdom extends to photography, which is partly why the publications work, I think, because there's some lovely pictures in, you know, particularly the historic gardens and historic churches, it's just filled with really great pictures. And it's very self-indulgent. Anyway, I've taken a photograph which I think captures it. We always need photographs, particularly of, you know, the main subjects. Didn't mention training as being one of the main subjects. Promoting your work at the summer school is everybody needs to know about it.
Well, yes. I mean, on your website, there is the whole thing about training, and there are various training providers that you mention there. and you kindly include the summer school, but there are quite a few others for people who might want to do the odd day course or go further and do more substantial masters, for example. So it's a fantastic resource in that sense. Yeah. How can people get in touch with you, or is it just simply a matter of going onto the website? You mentioned a new website. Will that be linked from your existing, or how's that all going to work?
Yes, there'll be a good link from our existing from buildingconservation.com, which will go across to sustainable heritage. My own email address is jonathan@buildingconservation.com, and yes, anybody can contact me. It's well published on the internet, and I welcome inquiries of all sorts. So yeah, happy to help wherever I can.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you both very much indeed.
You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
The podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.